Good morning, everybody. All participants of webinar on integration of measures for adaptation to climate change and disaster risk reduction in planning and implementation of national adaptation plans. Thank you for your participation. My name is Lilieva from Practical Action, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's webinar. First, I would like to give you some technical indications. Can you hear me well? And for those of you who have not yet used this platform, I would like to give you some instructions. First, presentations can be listened to in Spanish and English with simultaneous interpretation. You can choose your language with the button at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen where it says your language. There you just select your language. The messages at the chat can also be entered in Spanish and translated into English. Just point on the message and you will see the translation of that message. If you have any problems with the audio or the video, you can refresh your browser, and if not, you can just write to the technical assistance where is the question mark on the bottom left hand corner of your screen. If you cannot see the full slides, you can reduce the size of the browser and you can then will be able to see in a full screen. We'll share the slides and the recording of the webinar with all participants of the webinar after we finish. On today's webinar structure, we have to welcome three experts on climate change. After three presentations, we have a question and answer sessions where you will be able to ask your questions on the chat. Having said that, I would like to welcome, on behalf of Practical Comunica PENAC, the community that is an initiative of UN Environment through the Regatta project, and it's implemented with Practical Action. Its main aim is to support the officers and others in elaboration of national adaptation plans to climate change in the Latin American region as well as the Caribbean region. The PENAC process represents a quite important opportunity for having an intersectoral approach that would address not only climate risks but also different other factors. This webinar will seek to present case study on horizontal integration with risk reduction and to answer three questions. What is the importance of adaptation and risk reduction approach under this context of climate change? What are the main benefits and opportunities, challenges, and limitations to do that? And how could this strengthen the planning process and implementation of the adaptation plans? For that, we invited three experts. Daniel Stothard, he is Regional Officer of Regional Humanitarian Affairs Officer for Latin America and the Caribbean of UN Environment. Jennifer Walid, Program Management Officer of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and Marilise Turnbull, International Consultant and co-author of Towards Resilience, a guide for disaster risk reduction and adaptation to climate change. It is a pleasure to welcome Dan Stothard. He is the Regional Humanitarian Affairs Officer in his program of disaster and problems in Latin America of the Olynyk Regional Office. He also worked in the region for 8 years in Guyana, Haiti, and also in Dominican Republic, where he worked for the last 6 years as a consultant for disaster risk. Before that, he worked in Uganda, Kenya, and Senegal with an introduction on the topic, and also helping strengthening the knowledge on the role of ecosystems and risk reduction and adaptation to climate change. Having said that, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Daniel Stothard. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much, Lily. Good morning, everybody. I would like to say, by saying a recent story, my colleagues received of climate change here in UN Environment received a request from a government. I don't think I need to mention the government for support in the formulation of a project for adaptation to climate change, specifically related to extreme climatic events. And the ideas that were presented by this country's authority were, for me, 80% of those ideas were ideas of preparation for disasters, to improve risk assessment, etc. But all the ideas that came from the Authority of Climate Change didn't reflect the work that I know was done in that country for many, many years with emergency institutions at the community level, through Red Cross, different NGOs, the government, etc., on the same topic. And I had to tell my colleagues that many of that work was already done. The thing is that it was not done with the Authority of Climate Change, but through civil protection. And for me, there we had the first challenge as for integration. We have two different authorities with different separate mandates that are related, and they work on related topics, especially civil protection. It includes the response and penetration for events that are not only climatic related, but they work events that are related, or maybe sometimes similar events. The times of civil protection are shorter, they're more immediate. Even when it is for preparation, they're normally saying shorter term programs, and usually they have different political prioritization levels. That would depend on the country, but there are many countries that give a lot of priority. They prioritize climate change, and sometimes even more than the preparation for disasters. Donors normally work in different ways with different financing lines, and even inside the United Nations we have different leading agencies for risk reduction and climate change. That generates or has generated a difficulty for communication among professionals in almost all levels within the countries, at the local level, academic level also. But if adaptation is a good path towards disaster mitigation, we have to go further than just improving communication between these institutions of climate change and civil protection institutions. The synergy that we have identified has been identified at the project level. I believe that Lily has some materials to share with this webinar. It is a document, a draft by UN Environment and partners 3 years ago, addressing opportunities of climate change and risk disaster risk management, but we still have a way to go in order to create a systematic approach to this at the national level, by creating mandates, etc. You will see that in this document, the examples of integrations that we have right now, they are quite examples of the project level, more operative approach than strategic or national plans. In both things, disaster risk management and adaptation to climate change, activities for planning are crucial, whether in national adaptation plans or national adaptation of disaster risk management or emergency plans. We have different overlapping in the Sendai framework and also in the Paris Agreement. Each framework, each agreement refers to that topic. The two topics address some of the same situation and they get closer. And I address this issue as something that is even bigger. And for example, when the disaster risk management gets involved in the resilience and the protection of investment in development. So the synergies among the plans now is the next step and the next essential step. We have some synergies at the project level, at the level of local initiatives, but now I think the challenge is to climb that, just make it systematic to cross both topics at the planification at the national and even regional level. I wonder if arriving 2031 we'll have just one agreement for two topics, disaster risk management and climate change, and I hope that from there we'll have more frequently one national plan. But I don't think that we need to work up to 2031 in order to start incorporating the disaster risk management within the national plans for adaptation. So I think the webinar is ideal. It's essential in order to start to push to this, to cross-cutting to this on this topic, and to start doing this more frequently and more strategically and more regularly. I'm quite happy to have the opportunity today to speak on this. So Lily, you have the floor as well as our speakers. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much for your introduction. And thank you for stressing and highlighting that it's important to find this synergy and to include these two efforts jointly. Having said that, we continue with our two speakers. We continue with Jennifer Olynyk, Program Management Officer of United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Jennifer is part of the regional team for the Americas since 2007 within the Americas office. He is the focal point for monitoring the implementation of Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and on things related to gender, disability, childhood, and civil society. Jennifer is also the geographic officer for South America, except Brazil and Chile, and she is the coordinator of a regional project for South America with financing of humanitarian assistance of the European Commission and through the program IPECO. Jennifer will present the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030. It's a tool for adaptation to climate change and national adaptation plans. It's a pleasure to give the floor to Jennifer. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I loved starting with Dan's words because I believe that he captured quite well the main challenges that we are facing, not only here in the region but at low global level. We have, for the first time, we have an agenda for 2030 that covers global frameworks for adaptation to climate change, for objectives of sustainable development and reduction of disasters. But we are seeing that those global agendas face a quite strong challenge that move the threats and to communicate and coordinate among these different communities. The Agenda 2030 has to do with the urban agenda that actually what we seek is a long-term vision for the well-being and the human rights. At the end, we will have to consider that and what to do daily, how when we are working, how can we have that holistic approach and in our institutions and our communities. It is a quite consolidated agenda, but it's not easy to break that scheme. With that, I will present this entire framework and some processes that come with that in the region. This slide that you see for me captures the challenge of integrating those agendas. That is the front page of the UNFCCC, the Conference on Climate Change of the United Nations, and we see where we have those agendas, but to reduce our weakness is not an easy task, and we have to consider all those agendas. Having said that, the Sendai framework has some follow-up for a global agreement from 2005 to 2015. It's a Hyogo action framework that seeks to address the disaster risk reduction. But since it was the first document with that framework, the focus was not as ambitious as the Sendai framework. So the Sendai present is that it shows a way of progressing not only on what but also in the how. It's quite holistic. As you can see on the screen, we consider the objective here, the main guides explain very well the role of the different interest groups, and the Hyogo Action Plan, that was a global agreement that was agreed by the member states, meaning that that was not a sectorial agreement that was discussed by only experts on the topic or by civil society protection systems. It was a negotiation process among the same member countries, because that entails a commitment of the country that reflects in all sectors. With that, as you can see on the screen, what we try to do is a more holistic approach for disaster risk reduction that takes into account not only disasters due to natural phenomena, but also technological phenomena, anthropological phenomena, etc. And we consider different sectors. And it also touches not only the society, but also the dwellings and the people and the communities. It's quite important to take into account with the Sendai framework is that for the first time we set some global goals. As you can see here, some of them have to do with reducing the negative factors in order to increase the positive factors. And out of those 3 goals, we have 6 that aim towards 2030 and 1 2020. That's That's because the one of the goals is necessary in order to work the other works that has to do with reducing the amount of diseases caused by disasters, reducing the affected people, economic losses, but also at the same time to increase the cooperation among institutions, among nations, and different institutions. Within that, we consider 4 priorities because we recognize that in order to achieve those goals, we need to have a conclusion of that, and that information implies that an information is arriving to people and the decision makers in a way to make decisions that have sense. The second thing has to do with governance. As Dan mentioned, we have to work with long-term topics. It's not an easy task. That's why we required a high-risk support with normative framework that implies why are we penetrating not only all sectors but also all adaptation levels. The third has to do with investment and reduction of risk for resilience. Here we are talking about not only risk reduction but also to assure that investments are sensitive to risk, and that has to do with public-private alliances and all things that have to do with investment. We are not able to continue working and building cities that if they do not take into account a long-term vision. And the agreement has to do with the preparations for disasters, but also with the idea of building something better. We will always have risk. So we need to take measures in order to improve conditions in which we are living, under which we are living. So we have 3 axes. One that has to do with the existing risk, that is known as corrective. The other thing has to do with the perspective, and the third axe that has to do with increased resilience in order to face the residual risk. I mean, the risk that we will always have reduced if we face the other 2. But in order to know capacities on countries and communities in order to face that risk. The Sendai framework was adopted in 2015 in the World Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction, in which the governments accepted to form a group work in order to do the follow-up, meaning that gives us some indicators for the 7 global goals and the terminology. That was a process of several meetings, and the report of that work group was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations 2000 February the 2nd, 2017. So there's an agenda of indicators in order to arrive to those 7 goals, and it's important to highlight that work group also mentioned the task of the office the mandate of the office I work for to support, to help. Last year we did a report on this situation of preparation of data, measuring and risk and registration of risk, to see the state of the countries in order to start to measure risk and the progress towards the goal. Also, we developed, in coordination with the countries, a technical note. So we have indicators that were defined by the countries. Now we have technical orientation on metadata and what type of information we need and when it was developed, how to do the calculations, and also the information from basic to the optimal information. Here the main idea is that the country have a baseline from 2005 to 2015 to see the progress in 2020 and 2030. So this process of monitoring is done online and with measurements and calculations that are already designed and defined. We can enter information on a easily, and the system just calculates the progress year by year, year after year. So here what we can see, we don't have time to go into detail on the indicators, but we can see here the practice community, you can see it. And they respond to the Sendai goals as to ODS. And we're talking about the objectives, as you see, 1, 11, and 13. They have to do with poverty reduction. In that sense, in order to accomplish the E goal that has to do with national and local strategies and plans for 2020, we have supporting from our office the work of some countries that will have those national plans. And it is important to mention that those national plans have to be with the support of a high-level support in order to penetrate that community with climate change and with those that are developing national plans and the different objectives to face and improve the situation in terms of human rights that are quite holistic. So in South America, Colombia have already a plan from here to 2025. Argentina developed its plan that is about to be approved by the Council. Paraguay is on the way. Chile is about to start. And the UNASUR have some, but some of them were not approved. But there's a strategy from UNASUR and a strategy of the Andean countries in Central America. Costa Rica has a plan 2016-2013. Honduras was not formally approved, but it was developed, and it is interesting to say that it's a gender approach. Guatemala is in process, and I understand that we have a participant that is among us that is supporting that process. So greetings to Raquel and the Central America level through the CEPEDENAC. We are working to update the Central American policy of risk management policy aligned with the Sendai framework, and posteriorly to that, and after that we'll work with the Central America plan. That also is articulated with the plans at the 6th level. And the Caribbean, the process is quite different. In collaboration with SEDEMA, we are working in order to organize the comprehensive risk disaster management strategy, and after that we will work with six countries in order to develop the national plans. What we see now, I'm sorry, I lost a slide. I'll go going back a little bit. Something that is important to consider is that last year we approved a working group through CEPAL, and the Brussels work group centered in the mitigation and registration of indicators for reduction of risk, disaster risk, among the Sustainable Development Goals, was mentioned by Peru and Paraguay, and that group was created, and several groups were added. We hope that several other countries add to this, and we will have the role of the technical for the following period, 2018-2019. Something else that was just approved last year in December through CELAC is a regional strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean of disaster risk management in the agriculture sector and for food security and nutritional. In this process, and as we progress, we have seen some recommendations. First, it has to be a dialogue process, participative, inclusive, and with the support of the highest level. Here, the importance is not to reproduce a document only for reproducing a document. It has to be centered in the process. It has to be several months of dialogue with sectorial working groups, including, of course, environment, climate change, planning, and all main sectors of the country. If not, that plan will just remain being a sectorial plan. And the idea is that we need to penetrate and to have articulated plans. It has to have the highest political approval. It has the normative framework, policies, legislations, and needs to be honored. It has to be articulated with national development plans and adaptation to climate change. And it has to highlight the selection of indicators to which we respond, not only the global framework indicators, but also context of the same country and the needs of that country in order to measure and monitor the advances at the country level. For that, we are publishing a words to action. It's some sort of a guideline in order to support the national adaptation plan. Some challenges have to do with the same thing, whether the full articulation among communities, the coordination among institutions in acting levels. It's quite a strong challenge. How can we assure that the institutional level, country, United Nations, through different actors involved, donors, international community, we are not seeing each plan as a sector itself. It has to be a long-term vision of the country. And governance is fundamental. If it doesn't have the higher support from planning, finance, and all, we will have a lot of challenges. And sharing experience and data and information in order to, for example, have a platform where information goes or where it is available, understandable, is easy to understand for different decision makers, is fundamental, and it's still a challenge. Opportunities, we do have those frameworks, whether at the global and regional levels. The monitoring system that whether the Sendai of others or others, is also a way where we have different efforts to collaborate, but selection of indicators will be fundamental. The dialogue spaces have to be multi-sectorial and participative, and we have to take advantage of the spaces and the existing mechanisms, for example, alliance, that are public and private. Since I don't have much time, I will go to the main considerations. We talked about governance or governability, as different country defines this. The data risk assessment has to be risk assessment that are joint, whether for mitigation in terms of adaptation to climate change, as for risk management, and for the well-being and sustainable development of the community. Evaluations of capacities is important to have a development of capacities that respond to different needs in the countries. For that, the UNHCR is working with the Global Institution of Education, GETI, that is based in Korea, by doing some consultation at the different regions. Here in the region was in Panama, 26 and 27 of October last year, in order to have a global strategy of development of capacities. Financing is fundamental. We need to have the necessary resources in order to develop the capacities at the country level to face that agenda in the long term. The budget assignation, allocation, and resources and finance. Here are some documents. I don't have much time. I don't think this slide is working. Here you have some key documents for you to see the indicators, the terminology, this INC framework, and the technical orientation as to how to embark metadata, calculations, among other things for indicators. And there it is fundamental to consider that if take into account that each country has to do this for its different context. However, we have some guidelines for this process, and there's a link to the document we saw in the beginning. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for giving us this summary of such a complex topic in so little time. We learned the important points as for risk management, and within the Sendai framework that would be relevant when seeing, approaching the topic, addressing the topic, and how to elaborate, incorporate these points in the national adaptation plans. And thank you for giving us this panorama of the different progress in the different countries in the region. I will share in a minute in the chat all the publications that you shared for participants to access the documents easier. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your participation. Now, the following speakers, continue with the following speaker, and you have the pleasure to give the floor to Marilyn. She's an international consultant. She has 20 years in experience of the social development and humanitarian sectors in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Africa, Asia, Europe, and North America. Yes, she has experience in disaster risk management, adaptation to climate change, and resilience, and established the unity of adaptation and reduction of risk in the Oxfam organization in 2007. And she helped Oxfam to become an institution for resilience. She produced the report on the state of the nations, United Nations, in disaster risk management in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in 2009. She's a co-author of the Guide for Resilience that was published in 2013. It is a guide for professionals on risk management and programming, adaptation to climate change. Maria-Liz will present part of this guide, the principles, and will address a case study from El Salvador. It is a pleasure to give the floor to Maria-Liz. Thank you, Maria-Liz. Buenos días a todos. Creo que está bien que hable en inglés, ya que se podría hacer. Si no se puede, es un placer estar aquí. Gracias por invitarme. En Calgary, en Canadá, estamos a menos 18 grados, así que puede ser un poquito distinto el clima de lo que están experimentando. Voy a hablar preguntas que vamos a presentarnos. Preguntamos en este seminario web cuál es la importancia de este enfoque para los planes de adaptación, una de las oportunidades, beneficios y retos y limitaciones, y cómo podemos fortalecerlos. Voy a tratar de hablar sobre estos dos. ¿Cuál es la importancia de este enfoque? Yo creo que debería ser integrado, un enfoque integrado, y debería ser promovido en la guía a la cual nos referiremos.
Should I continue? Okay, good. Sorry about that, slight technical hitch. Okay, so just to repeat a little bit, the key message I was talking about is that I feel it should not be a DRR approach to adaptation. It should actually be an integrated approach. The reason for this is because of this, huge area of common concerns, as you can see in the presentation, which are the common concerns of the DRR community and of the climate change community, which hopefully in a few years' time will no longer have those separate communities and will all be working towards the same goals. So what are those benefits and opportunities of working together? Well, by working together, we focus on the outcomes, which is increasing people's resilience, reducing vulnerability, and protecting the environment, enabling people to thrive despite the shocks and stresses. And in fact, because of those shocks and stresses, they learn to adapt, we learn to adapt and learn, okay? So that's one of the benefits, is it focuses on the outcomes. It also maximizes resources. It's very silly to have different departments with different budgets for the same purposes. And the only thing we can do until that structural change happens in NGOs, in governments, in intergovernmental agencies, is to work together so that those resources can be maximized and there's no duplication. A little bit, as Dan was referring to at the beginning, that if one group of people or one part of government wants to do something that the others have already done, that's going to be a duplication. Also, by having an integrated approach, we draw on a larger body of evidence of effectiveness. DRR work has been ongoing now for probably more than 20 years, and under different names. And climate change adaptation work a little bit more recently, but with more of a push on learning. And so by bringing those lessons together, then we're more likely to be able to do something that's effective, that's proven, that's tried and tested. What are the challenges and limitations of an integrated approach? Well, you've always got this balance, this tension between looking at the short term and the long term. Traditionally, DRR approaches have tended to be a little bit more short term and climate change adaptation longer. And the other limitation or challenge is that by using an integrated approach, we may focus only on those common concerns, which are the climate-related hazards, shocks and stresses, and we leave out some of those parts that only belong to DRR, which are to do with non-climatic hazards, and the elements of climate change and climate change adaptation, which are not really to do with specific hazards. So with that, I'm going to move on. And as Lily explained at the beginning, I'm going to be referring to a resource that was produced in 2013. It's still highly relevant. I work as a consultant for many organizations, and I use it all the time in almost every assignment. I'm not trying to promote it for my own benefit. I actually would like to point out that it was produced by the Emergency Capacity Building Project, which was a consortium of major agencies, so CARE, Oxfam, Mercy Corps, Save the Children, and World Vision, and it drew on all of their different expertise and experience. Now, this guide has 10 principles that are applied to all stages of the program cycle, key settings, so conflict settings, urban, early recovery, slow onset hazards, I think there are some others I can't remember now, and to also apply to all the key sectors. So in this guide you'll find application of these principles to livelihoods, food security, natural resource management, WASH, health, education and protection. There could be more, but then the book would be never ending. And I'm going to be focusing a little bit only on the natural resource management, food security and livelihoods. So because we don't have time for any more. But I'm happy to answer people's questions afterwards on the other aspects. So the 10 principles that the guide promotes for this integrated approach are, in all of your work, increase your understanding of the hazard and climate change context. Don't focus only on one aspect or the other. We know that there are common concerns, but there are also parts that fall out of that middle area. Increase understanding of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. There's a tendency often just to focus on hazard and climate change, rather than looking at the elements that make us vulnerable and why we're exposed and what capacities people have. Recognize people's rights and responsibilities. So right holders, we all have responsibilities as well as citizens, but governments have primary responsibility for protecting their citizens. And so to recognize that and to recognize the importance of working together. Strengthen the participation of and action by the population at risk. Don't do things for people and create conditions for people to be able to do what they believe is relevant. Promote systemic engagement and change. So this is really important, particularly we know that disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation involve all sectors. They affect all aspects of our lives. And so it's very important that this doesn't get stuck in one department or one sector, but that all sectors come to work together. Foster synergy between multiple levels. One of the typical problems of project work to date has been that something happens at a local level that's disconnected from government policy or local authorities' strategies or plans for a 4-year cycle. Or the other way around, that there's a great strategy at national level, but it doesn't filter down to the community level. So the other principle is to foster that synergy between those levels and make that one of the objectives of our work. Number 7, draw on and build diverse sources of knowledge. So that's sources of knowledge from science, from traditions, from local customs, indigenous practices. Instill flexibility and responsiveness. We don't know it all, so we need to always be monitoring and aware of what's changing and how we need to change in response to that. Address different timescales we've covered a little bit before, and do no harm. One of the key principles that whatever we do, we have to have done a good assessment beforehand and continue to understand the impacts as we do it. So, as you'll see in this guide, and I think someone might have shared the link already, it exists in various other languages as well. And so what you'll find is the application of those principles to all those different sectors. This is just a little snapshot there of what that looks like and how you would apply a principle if you're working in, let's say, natural resource management or a livelihoods project. If you're working in a large program that covers multiple sectors, then you have to look at all of them at once. Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly about how these principles were applied and the challenges that were found in a municipality in El Salvador, a project that I went to evaluate last year. And I've chosen this one because it helps to ground some of those principles that we're talking about. So this is a municipality that's feeling the effects of climate change. People no longer very sure of planting seasons, of rainy seasons. The project, in fact, was designed for a flood context because flooding has become increasingly prominent. And then over the last 2 years, the drought was more prominent. So it had to be adapted as it went along as well. And it's a community that lives on the edge of mangroves. It's a coastal community, so very highly exposed to flooding, for example. And this was a 3-year project funded by Oxfam, but implemented by local organisations. So let me move on. Okay, so just to remind us the benefits, it was a project that focused on resilience, so really looking at protecting natural resources and making sure that the community is more resilient at the end of it. It maximised resources because it brought together funding from Oxfam and from various other NGOs with different names of projects, so some were climate change adaptation, some were natural resource management, and also funding from the local authorities, although quite limited. And it drew on a body of evidence that came from Oxfam's work in other contexts, in Central America, in Melanesia, in the Pacific, and in Africa. Okay, so let's have a look at the application of the 10 principles. So the first one's about understanding the context, both from the hazard and climate change effects side and from exposure, vulnerability, and capacities. So you'll see under each little heading of food security, livelihoods, and natural resource management, little excerpts from the guide which give you step-by-step guidance on what you need to do. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how the project handled that. So, for example, here in San Luis, here you can see that the context of being on the mangroves. So not only did they produce risk maps at the community level, which is very typical of DRR projects, but they also carried out studies of environmental impacts and of impacts of climate change on their surroundings and on the wider area. They started through the leadership of the communities, they started to pay much more attention to weather forecasts and monitoring, so that they would have stronger evidence and history of trends on which to plan. And they carried out capacity assessments, so to understand the capacities that the community already had, different parts of the community, the knowledge and skills that they possessed mainly for their livelihoods, but also for other types of life skills. So recognizing rights and responsibilities and strengthening participation. Here again you have some excerpts from the book about using different communication channels to increase understanding and using participatory methods and advocating to governments for transparent processes of natural resource management. So here in the project, let me just move on, one more slide. They focused very much on capacity building of women's groups and of hands-on testing of new techniques. So the project was all about experimental approaches to agriculture and diversification of livelihoods. And so the participation of community at risk was absolute. They led the project by the end of it. That's the great thing about a 3-year project. But also very strong emphasis on trying to coordinate with the local authorities, which is a challenge. In this case, there was a change of government just at the beginning of the project, which meant that all relationships had to be rebuilt. But bear in mind that that's the responsibilities of the state, then this was considered very important to continue to emphasize. Okay, principles 5 and 6, so promoting systemic engagement and change and fostering synergy between multiple levels. So here you have some parts from the guide about advocacy and working in partnership with other relevant actors. Through this project, the leaders of the communities involved and the NGOs involved, they did group training on agriculture together with local authorities, trying to bring in that sort of local to municipal and then to national authorities level. But they also engaged very much on infrastructure that was needed. So here you can see examples of water provision. This was, remember, during a drought period. But also on early warning systems. So these items of infrastructure are costly, and it's very important that different organisations and different entities work together for them, and that you build a holistic approach so that to work towards longer-term resilience. Principle 7, draw on and build diverse sources of knowledge and instill flexibility and responsiveness. So a lot of the guidance in the book is about encouraging innovation and diversification. And so in this project, there was a strong element of diversification and support for savings groups. So savings groups help in many ways. They help to manage those kind of short-term and long-term priorities. They give you a lot of flexibility. The majority of the women in this project participated in the savings group, and some men, but because it had a strong gender component, it was prioritized for women. And through those savings groups, they then were able to set up other types of complementary income-generating activities that could help manage the variation in climate and the different unpredictabilities of their traditional livelihoods. And one of the examples of businesses that was set up was a type of fertilizer that was then produced in a quite widespread fashion in the community and sold in the community and to other communities. And that fertilizer was organic and fitted very much within the theme of the project, but also was very effective in terms of helping to manage some of the variations in the soil and created by the weather conditions. Okay, and the last two principles, addressing different timescales and do no harm. This was a challenge for the project. It's very difficult when you're working on a 1 year or a 3 year time frame to think about things beyond that. But that's what was one of the aspects that was left as learning in the last phase of the project, to see how it would be able to continue. And to assess the sustainability of livelihoods. And that's something that you need to build up over a period to look at projections and how different livelihood strategies are going to be able to cope and manage in a changing context. And one of the other very important aspects of this project was, as you know, Central America and these countries and many of the countries that we live in, we have issues of social violence. And so anything that is done at community level and with local authorities has to take into account that security or insecurity context. So even if we're talking about natural resources or people's livelihoods, they're highly connected to the backdrop of social violence, which is another aspect that we need to bring into this integrated planning approach. And at the end of the project, they were beginning to gather information about early warning indicators of changes, slow changes, that then with the increased knowledge that they had built up through that project, that they would be able to then use and innovate, adapt, and plan new ways of addressing the challenges that they're facing. So how can this strengthen and enrich the planning and implementing of national adaptation plans? I'm leaving that to the floor to decide. I hope that this case study can bring a little bit of experience from the ground to complement some of the other presentations on national and global frameworks.
Thank you very much, Marilis. Thank you for giving us this deeper approach on the guide presented on these approaches, and in order to have a comprehensive approach considering the key elements of risk reduction and adaptation to climate change, as well as how we could implement in the practice with a case study in El Salvador. Thank you very much. Thank you very much on the information on this webinar. Having said that, we can start the question and answer session. If you have any questions, please write your questions on the chat, whether in Spanish or in English, and we will have that translated into the other language using the machine translation tool, where it says translation. You can click on that and to translate. Please say to whom it would be addressed, the question, and if possible, where the question is coming. While we wait for the questions, I would like to mention that we will share the recording and the PPTs. We will send that to your emails in order for you, so you can have the important information on the webinar. So far we have 3 questions. I'll start with 2 questions for Marilis. One question comes from Bedemi. I would like to know how those saving groups worked. That is one of the questions. How those groups, the saving groups worked, the group saving clubs. Another question comes from Sebastian. I will read all the questions for Marlies and I will give the floor to Marlies. Sebastian is, do we have other similar experiences? At the national, whether done at the national level, community level? With those two questions, I'll give the floor. I have another question, I'm sorry. From Gabriela. How were the dialogue spaces of the savings clubs with local authorities? With 3 questions, I give the floor to Mauricio. And then we will continue with the other questions. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah. So the saving clubs had some unexpected results, interesting ones and good ones. So they operated so that the group met weekly. Had a savings box with a key and another key kept in a different place so that there was no question of one person, running off with all the money. And they established rules, and it's a very established methodology that was used for the project. I can send details after it's been used. It's very widespread. And you could save any amount, like literally you could save a few pesos or pennies, as long as you committed to coming to the meeting and putting it in. That was what really helped, because the women didn't have to commit an amount they just weren't able to find. And they used those savings. So there was a payout at the end of a certain period. I think it's about 6 months. And then you could reinvest for the following period. But if you needed to withdraw from those savings due to a necessity in the meantime, you could, with the authorization of the other members of the group. So those savings were used to overcome different adversities, such as a failed crop. You could then withdraw from that to purchase some more seeds or to purchase some other inputs that you needed. If there was some other kind of calamity, you could. But one of the most interesting findings was that we tend to think that communities and families and people are always waiting for the next large disaster. They're not. They have regular disasters practically on a daily basis, like we all do. If you don't have a savings account, if you don't have a bank account, or you don't have a credit facility, how do you deal with those? So this enabled them to do things like, if they had a sick child, they were also able to get medicines. And that didn't throw the family into debt by having to borrow money for that, and then that would affect their next investment in their livelihoods, for example. So some very, very interesting findings about having access to savings and credit. What were the overall results of the project, somebody asked? I think that's Edgardo. Very positive, very positive. It was a 3-year project, and more time would have been needed. So it just goes to show that those 12-month, 18-month projects really are very, very challenging. This one would have been benefited from 5 years to really capture the learning, and hopefully parts of it will continue. One of the aspects that came out very, very clearly was the principle of fostering systemic change and working between levels. So I think, as Dan pointed out at the beginning, these projects will only remain as projects, as nice experiences on a very local level, unless they engage with government at different levels. And that was the part that was very hard. As you know, with different cycles, political cycles, things can change very quickly, and then you have to rebuild those relationships. But that's an absolute necessity. There's no point trying to work in isolation. So that was one of the learnings that came out of it. In terms of the savings groups, I think it says space dialogue with between savings groups and local authorities. As far as I was aware, there were no issues, no problems in terms of the local authorities and the savings groups. It was seen actually as a positive thing. I imagine, and I'm sure you understand that for many reasons these things have to remain with those who are directly involved. But I imagine that there was some kind of conversation with groups, armed groups operating in the area that enabled those savings groups to go ahead, because and nothing can happen in those areas without those armed groups knowing what's going on. And so that's something we have to take into account, because there are official authorities and there are unofficial authorities. Handing back.
Thank you very much, Marilis, for answering the questions. We have a question for Jennifer from Gabriela. It has to do with indicators and SENDI framework. What cases were managed and if indications were covered? Jennifer, you have the floor. Thank you. The information delays are annual each year, or every year, so that we needed to inform on problems that encountered. Who can answer? Who is responsible? The tools are not for government. We have in English the guidelines or the technical orientation norms that is available to the public. The system online will be available on the 1st March and then 1st May for the other special materials. We have a system where each user can access with a password. There are two types of users: one, the coordinator user, and one, the user of collaboration. Due to this SENDI framework, each country should have chosen the responsible. That is through a local notice communicated through the paper. In the case of Argentina, was designed by the white helmets. The indicates that had the coordinating role, but that as a different could give that to different situations, and they had needed to inform the situation to other institutions through the dialogue process. That almost in all countries of the region have national platforms. It also have a reporting space. And this year, 2021 year, we will celebrate the platform for the risk reduction in the Americas. That happens every 2-3 years, and then we have the global platforms. That is also a space for members of the civil society, or private or academic, or any, could collaborate with that monitoring process. And also 2 weeks ago we had a note informing the countries on the delays for the 2018 process, for that information to fit the political reform, the high level of MS, and among other things. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer. 2 more questions for you. We have a question from Mauri Madrid. At the end of the process, how can you indicate your goals? And from Astrid Cruz, how can you articulate the national plans with the territorial plans of risk management? You have the floor again. I don't know if the question was clear on Nicaragua, but I can say that Nicaragua, we are coordinating with SENAPEL with the baseline that would allow to be monitoring the progress. Also for defining the national indicators we are coordinating that through CIMATEL, but also we respond to the work that we are doing on Central America with policies and the reduction of risk reduction in Central America. The second question: national plans, territorial plans. First, I need to say that we have a campaign within our mandate that has to do with a initiative that started with a campaign of developing resilient cities, which defines two essential aspects that had to needed to be taken into account by the municipality to increase the resilience and reduce the risk and vulnerability and increase the capacities. Through this, our office gives technical support to municipalities that have requested it. Quito just finished the local plan for disaster risks, but each country has to see the way to assure that would meet the requirements, defined requirements at the country level. Meaning that some countries said, for example, in Colombia, with the 1523 law of Colombia, that in order to develop local plans, the regional unity of risk management should be responsible to survey that it meets that or not. That is essential. And to see if those are articulated with the goals and indicators of this entire framework. And also in a moment, and for the moment, I understand later on, I understand that we have an online system that would allow the local governments to monitor the progress in the local plans, and that it is also articulated with the process of the country, that we need to take into account that this entire framework is not binding. So that would depend on each country to define how that works in each country differently. We cannot work only at a national or local level, but we need to articulate this. In most of the countries, we already have that legislation framework in order to assure that legislation, at least among the levels in the terms of institutions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Last question from Rafael Paredes for you. How can we work in the other different decision-making levels? We had a national platform for risk reduction that was managed by different countries. There were dialogue spaces where we participate at a local level, whether local level as for representative of civil society. And the regional platform mentioned this year was going to be in Colombia. We also have incidents spaces of civil society and countries in the region. We're working with this global network, and then coordination of national coordination and the agenda. The decisions are made by the Consulting Committee. And we consult with different agencies of the nations. Colombia government participated this year, the previous government also. It is important to highlight that we also have participation of representative of the academic sector and representative of a civil society. There are several networks in which we work in order to receive some type of input from NGOs. There's another one focused on people with disabilities. There's also a network of agencies that is centered in gender, childhood. There are many spaces that effectively we have. This is an agenda of everybody, and if we are not participating in this local dialogue in the different sectors, then we will fail. The main spaces that we have as an agency are those. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for replying the questions, and thank you, Marilys. Having said that, we can just finish the question and answer session. With that webinar, we worked from different perspectives, but with a common message. We need to seek for synergies as for risk management and planning and implementation of adaptation, climate change adaptational measures, and to have a comprehensive approach and to see how those elements could work. We listen to the key topics and I remember how this is relevant for adaptation to climate change. Now we also witnessed some principles as to how to deal with this integration as different approaches with a El Salvador example. We hope that this information was useful, and with that we would like to invite you to future webinars. I have one more question for Dan. I will open this session for give the opportunity in order to give the opportunity to Hannah to answer the questions if there is an experience of the country that was able to have a normative approach. And you have the floor. Dan, you have the floor. I see that it's not possible due to the connection. I'm sorry, Fanny, but he won't be able to answer the question. In any case, we will try to send more information on it on the email that we will share with you with the presentations. As I mentioned, the following months we will be organizing other webinars on behalf of the PNAC practice community on gender approach and indigenous communities, how to incorporate the elaboration and of PNACs on national adaptation plans. Thank you very much on behalf of the community of practice to all three speakers, Jan, Marilys, and Jennifer, for your presentations and your time for participating in this webinar from different parts of the world. And thank you very much for your participation to all of you participants and your active participation with interesting questions and interesting discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much, and have a good day, afternoon, good evening. Goodbye.